How do you hide an object that weighs 6,000 tons, is the size of a 5-story building, and is sitting directly in the middle of a river in London, all while German spy planes are flying overhead trying to take pictures of it? And then, just to make things harder, how do you do that 212 times? This sounds like a riddle, or maybe a magic trick, but in 1944 it was the single most important question in the world. If the Allies couldn't answer it, the invasion of Europe was going to fail before a single boot hit the sand. So how did they do it? This is Critical Path, where we explore stories and innovations about our global supply chain that connect our world to your everyday life. Today, we are talking about the greatest magic trick in the history of military logistics. We are going back to World War II to talk about Operation Mulberry. You have probably heard of D-Day. You know about the beaches, the paratroopers, and the heroism. But the history books often skip over the most insane part of the plan. The part where a bunch of civil engineers decided that since they couldn't capture a port, they would just build 2 massive ones in England, break them into 40,000 pieces, tow them 100 miles across a hostile ocean, and reassemble them under artillery fire. It is a story about deception, concrete, and the absolute audacity of the supply chain. Let's set the scene. It is 1944. The European theatre is stuck in a grind. It is a logistical deadlock. You see, everyone focuses on the shooting, but the German High Command, specifically Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, understood a fundamental truth about modern warfare. He knew that while an army fights on its stomach, a tank fights on gas. You cannot just land 1 million men on a beach and wish them good luck. You need to feed them, you need to fuel their vehicles, you need to bring in heavy armor and millions of rounds of ammunition. To do that, you need a deep water port, you need cranes, you need docks, you need railheads, you need the heavy infrastructure of a major city. And Rommel knew this. That is why he built the Atlantic Wall. He turned every major French port, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, Brest, into an absolute fortress. And just to be safe, he wired the docks with explosives. His strategy was actually pretty sound. He basically said, let them land on the beaches, go ahead. They will run out of bullets in 48 hours because they can't offload the resupply ships. So the Allies had a problem. A big one. If you attack a port directly, the Germans will destroy it before you can capture it. We learned that the hard way during the disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942. But if you land on a beach, you can't offload the heavy tanks you need to win the war. The invasion was, mathematically speaking, impossible. Enter Winston Churchill. Now, Churchill was a man who treated the laws of physics as a suggestion rather than a hard rule. In 1942, he sent a memo to Lord Mountbatten. It wasn't a polite request, it was basically a demand for the impossible. He wrote about the need for piers that could float up and down with the tide on a sandy beach. And he ended the note with this legendary line, "Don't argue the matter, the difficulties will argue for themselves." And just like that, Operation Mulberry was born. The plan was simple, in that hold my beer kind of way. If we can't capture a port, we will bring one with us. Now, when I say port, I don't mean a few wooden planks. We need to talk about the hardware, because to understand the deception, you have to appreciate the sheer scale of the concrete monsters they were trying to hide. These weren't little pontoons. They were skyscrapers laid on their sides. The core of this artificial harbor was the breakwater. You need a wall to stop the waves, so ships can unload in calm water. The engineers designed these massive hollow concrete boxes called Phoenix caissons. Let's look at the specs on these bad boys. The largest ones, the Type A ones, were 200 feet long, 60 feet high, and 60 feet wide. They displaced 6,000 tons of water. 6,000 tons. Here is how they worked. They were built with internal air chambers, so they could float. You tow them over to Normandy, open up some valves, which they called seacocks, flood the chambers, and the whole unit sinks to the seabed to form a wall. They built 212 of these things. It required so much reinforced concrete that the British government actually had to halt the construction of airfields and stop repairing houses in London. Think about that. The Mulberry project effectively cannibalized the entire construction supply chain of the United Kingdom. But a wall isn't enough. You need to get the tanks from the ships to the beach. That brings us to the Sengese whales and the Tannozes beetles. The point whales were these floating steel bridges, linked together like a spine. They had to be flexible, because the tides in Normandy are intense. We are talking a 24-foot tidal range. The bridge had to rise and fall as the ocean moved. These bridges sat on top of concrete or steel pontoons called beetles, mostly because they looked like giant bugs floating on the water. And finally, you had the riscoran, spuds. These were the pierheads. They were massive steel barges with 4 legs. As the tide rose, electric motors would jack the platform up the legs so the deck remained level. If that sounds familiar, it is because this technology is the direct ancestor of the modern offshore oil rigs we use today. So we have 600,000 tons of concrete. We have floating bridges. We have jack-up platforms. And we have a problem. The central paradox of this entire episode is, how do you hide a 6,000-ton block of concrete that is sitting in a river in London? You can't put it in a warehouse, it's too big. You can't cover it with a tarp, it's too big. But you have to put it somewhere. They were building these things in dry docks along the Thames and the south coast, and as soon as one was finished, they had to move it to clear the dock for the next one. So where did they put them? They towed them to parking lots in the Thames estuary and off Selsey Bill. Right out in the open. And this is where the genius of the deception comes in. You don't hide the object. You rely on the enemy's arrogance. The Allies used a strategy we might call the sunk cost strategy. To prevent German reconnaissance pilots from looking down and saying, "Hey, that looks like a portable harbour wall," the Allies partially sank them. They flooded the tanks just enough so the structures rested on the shallow riverbed. Only a few feet of concrete poked above the waterline. From 20,000 feet up, they didn't look like skyscrapers. They looked like standard barges, or jetties, or anti-submarine boom defences. They just blended into the industrial noise of the river. But visual camouflage wasn't enough. They needed to mess with the Germans' heads. British intelligence, specifically the double-cross system, actively fed false information to German spies. They spun 2 different narratives. Narrative 1. Vorvolk. These are anti-aircraft towers, or flak towers, designed to protect London from bombers. Narrative 2. Vorvolk. These are boom defences meant to block the Thames from U-boats. The beauty of this is that both lies were plausible. The Germans looked at these huge concrete blocks and thought, defensive structures. Boring. Ignore them. But the primary reason this deception worked wasn't the camouflage or the spies. It was cognitive bias. The German engineers were brilliant, but they were rigid. They had analysed the problem of an Atlantic invasion. They looked at the rough seas of the English Channel and concluded that building an artificial harbour was technically impossible. And that is a dangerous trap. Because they believed it couldn't be done, they didn't look for evidence that it was being done. When a German analyst saw a photo of a Phoenix caisson, his brain categorized it as rubbish or paillar, barge, because the category of Bantenüse portable harbour, simply did not exist in his mind. It is a massive supply chain lesson. Your enemy often defeats themselves by assuming you face the same constraints they do. Now let's talk about the construction itself, because this was a civil war of its own. It pitted the Ministry of Supply against the military. By 1943, pretty much every able-bodied man in Britain was already in the army. So who was pouring all this concrete? They drafted 45,000 labourers. This included Irish navvies who were technically neutral but happy to work for the pay, men who were too old for the military draft, and specialised tradesmen pulled off other essential projects. The shortage of concrete was so bad that engineers were throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck. They even had a waffle board, where they tried to figure out how to lower the quality of the concrete just enough, so it would last 90 days, but not forever. They were optimizing for a very short lifespan. And here is my favorite part of the story, the wet canteens legend. Imagine you are a soldier. You have been assigned to guard a secret weapon. You are stationed on a Phoenix caisson that has been parked and sunk in the middle of the Thames River. You are basically living inside a hollow concrete block. It is wet. It is cold. And you are bored out of your mind. You need a skeletal crew on these things to monitor the pumps and man the anti-aircraft guns mounted on top. But there is a lot of downtime. Reports suggest that some of these caissons were turned into unofficial clubhouses. We are talking about wet canteens, which is military speak for a bar, card games, and guys fishing off the side. It was this bizarre existence where you are living inside the secret weapon that is going to win the war while just waiting for D-Day to start. Then, on June 6, 1944, the waiting ended. The deception was over. The parking lots were refloated. The valves were pumped out. The behemoths rose from the mud, and the strangest fleet in naval history set sail. We call it the Concrete Regatta, and it was a towing nightmare. You have to understand the physics here. A Phoenix caisson has the hydrodynamic properties of a brick. It is not designed to move through water. It took 150 tugs to move the harbour components. They grabbed every available tug from the UK and brought in a bunch from the US. The maximum speed of this fleet? 3 to 4 knots. That is walking speed. In fact, if the tide turned against them, they actually moved backward. Think about the tension. You are towing a building across the ocean. You are slow, you are massive, and you are defenseless. You are essentially serving up a concrete buffet for German E-boats, which are fast torpedo boats that patrol the channel. But as they approached Normandy, a funny thing happened. The German shore batteries, the guns on the cliffs, couldn't figure out what they were shooting at. They were expecting troopships, they were expecting destroyers. Instead, they look out and see miles of floating bridges and apartment blocks heading their way. They were confused. Under fire, the Royal Engineers and the US Seabees began slotting the pieces together. The Royal Engineers took Mulberry B, and the Americans took Mulberry A. It was like giant Legos in the middle of a war zone. By D+12, that's 12 days after D-Day, both harbours were fully operational. It seems like a perfect success story, right? Well, not quite, because we cannot discuss Mulberry without talking about the Great Storm of June 1944. This event serves as the ultimate A/B test for supply chain resilience. You see, there was a cultural difference in how the harbours were built. Mulberry A was in the American sector at Omaha Beach. The US commanders were obsessed with velocity. They wanted speed. They skipped steps. They didn't secure the Phoenix anchors properly because they wanted to offload cargo right now. They didn't use the floating breakwaters correctly. Mulberry B was in the British sector at Gold Beach. The British commanders were obsessed with durability. They followed the specs to the letter. They secured the anchors. They took their time. Then, the storm hit. It was the worst storm in the English Channel for 40 years. The result? Mulberry A, the American harbour, was annihilated. The floating roadways twisted into scrap metal. The caissons cracked. It was a total loss and had to be abandoned. Mulberry B? It suffered damage, sure, but it held. It survived. It became known as Port Winston. The takeaway here is brutal but important. In the supply chain, cutting corners on infrastructure to increase throughput works great, until the environment changes. The Americans optimized for a sunny day. The British optimized for reality. Despite the loss of the American harbour, the success of Mulberry B changed the war. The numbers are staggering. At its peak, Port Winston was offloading 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Over the course of 5 months, this temporary concrete port handled 2.5 million men. It moved 500,000 vehicles. It moved 4 million tons of supplies. This was a strategic victory of the highest order. The Germans actually held on to the major French ports like Cherbourg for months. If the Allies hadn't brought their own port, the advance would have stalled in July 1944 because they would have run out of fuel. The concrete Battleship bought the Allies the time they needed to capture a real port, Antwerp. So what is the lesson for us? The Mulberry harbours remain the ultimate example of lateral thinking in supply chain strategy. The constraint was clear. We cannot capture a port. The conventional solution would be to try harder to capture a port. And that would have failed. The lateral solution was to build a port in safety and ship it to the danger zone. The deception worked not because the caissons were invisible, but because the concept was inconceivable. The Germans lost because they lacked imagination. They prepared for a soldier to kick down the front door. They didn't prepare for the soldier to bring his own hallway, living room, and garage with him. We like to talk about modern buzzwords like agile logistics and modular supply chains. We act like these are new ideas invented by tech companies in Silicon Valley. But in 1944, a bunch of civil engineers in London built a modular, floating, 600,000-ton agile supply chain while being bombed. Maybe we should take notes. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. We live in a world of fragile supply chains. If the Germans had realized what those caissons were in 1943, a single squadron of bombers could have sunk them in the Thames, and the invasion would have been delayed by a year. My question to you is, what is the Mulberry of today? What is the impossible engineering feat we are ignoring because we think it can't be done? Is it bringing a port to Mars like Elon Musk's Starship? Is it 3D printing factories in our own homes? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your theories on the modern equivalent of the concrete battleship. Thanks for listening and watching. Please like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos about the global supply chain.